Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne. Kelley Lane is co-hosting today. This is a fully independent podcast. Now more than ever, independent media needs the support of listeners and viewers. Visit the website aroundtheempire.com to find out how to support the podcast and gain access to bonus content. Our guest today is Sam Husseini. We talk about his recent article, Albright's Funeral, the Sword and the Cross Come Together, and more. In a bonus question, we talk about the convergence of neoliberal and neoconservative actors in the foreign policy establishment and the Biden administration. Sam Husseini is a Washington, D.C. metro-based independent journalist who's been piercing through the establishment's falsifications for 25 years. His more recent work includes the possible lab origin of the pandemic, which he started writing about in the early days, and the Kings Bay Plowshares 7 trial. In the 1990s and the 2000s, he covered the Yugoslavia Wars, the sanctions policy against Iraq and the Iraq War. He is known for rigorously questioning officials, including Colin Powell, Mike Pence, Nancy Pelosi, Saudi Ambassador Turki bin Faisal, al-Saud, and many others. Welcome to Around the Empire. Kelley and I are co-hosting tonight, and we have a great guest, a friend of ours, Sam Husseini, who has just written a fantastic article that's getting a lot of very well-deserved attention, and we were eager to talk with him about this subject for a lot of reasons.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Sam, do you want to just introduce yourself a bit, like what you do now and a little bit of your background?
I work with the Institute for Public Accuracy and put out critical information, and I've been there for a little over 20 years. And so I've sort of lived this period where, at the time during the late 90s, I was trying to put out news releases, debunking these things in real time. And it's kind of funny, we decided to close the IPA office. So I was packing away a lot of these papers that had to do with this period of time as the war in Ukraine was going on, and then Madeleine Albright died. And it just, it was, moving out of the office that, where a lot of this stuff happened at the press building, and me trying to ask questions at different news events there and so on. But I would do a lot of my own writing. I have a Substack. People can see my writing at husseini.org. In my own personal capacity, I did a lot of stuff on pandemic origins and will continue to do stuff on pandemic origins and biowarfare and related issues at husseini.org and on the Substack.
Well, this article definitely has gotten a lot of attention. Albright's Funeral, the Sword and the Cross Come Together. And I think we'll start with, there was an interview where Madeleine Albright is asked if all the deaths in Iraq of Iraqi children were worth it. So we'll start with that clip, and then I'm going to go right to a segment where Sam is asking her the question about that at the National Press Club. So here we go.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
One very brief question on a related thing in the region. 2 years ago on 60 Minutes, you said that the price of 500,000 Iraqi children dying as a result of the sanctions largely was, quote, worth it. Do you regret making that statement, which got substantial play in the Arab world, though not much here?
Let me just say this. I have said, I do not actually remember saying that specifically.
I've seen it.
Well, then I guess I said it. Let me just say this. I believe that the fact that Iraqi children are dying is not the fault of the United States, but of Saddam Hussein. And I think it is ridiculous for the United States to be blamed for the dictatorial and cruel, barbaric ways that Saddam Hussein treats his people. So we have a responsibility which has to do with the issues of trying to keep weapons of mass destruction from proliferating. And I believe that Saddam Hussein is the one who is responsible for the tragedy of the Iraqi people. And in order to make up for that, it's the United States that led the effort to create this mechanism of oil for food. And we are the ones that keep pressing for it to happen at the United Nations. And Saddam Hussein still is not capable of accepting the procedure that the UN has designed in order to double the amount of food for oil. So you can't lay that guilt trip on me.
You don't think the U.S. has any culpability?
Yeah.
So in the article, you say Albright, Biden, and the Clintons covered for each other's criminal war making, and ultimately they all enabled and covered for Republican criminality as well. All showed they were capable of murderous deceits. And, you know, one of the things I kept thinking about, because Bill and Hillary were prominent, you know, at the funeral, in making these clips, is exactly how much of like a mentor and how much obviously Hillary Clinton really looked up to Madeleine Albright. And even in that clip, you know, where she says something about hard choices, I'm like, isn't that the title of Hillary's book? I don't know, it's just kind of eerie, you know, but you can really see that, you know, that she was a mentor. But yeah. What, you want to talk about that day at the press club, what that was like?
Sure. I'm glad I asked the question I did. I gotta say, just to begin on a note of self-criticism, a couple months before I asked that question, I really want to get into her answer and so on. There was the Ohio State town hall where Clinton wanted to bomb Iraq, or seemed to want to bomb Iraq, and he sent Albright and the head of the Pentagon, William Cohen, and his national security advisor, Sandy Berger, to try to sell the idea of war in Iraq. And people might have seen a clip of John Strange, as you know, saying, you know, what about all these other countries, and just calling out the hypocrisies of, and you know, I was just struck, I think, when I asked the question and when I look at it now, at how you know, ferocious they were able to be at the town hall meeting, and where the Clinton administration had to back off because, in large part, of the activism that took place on the ground in Ohio, along with Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the UN, went to Iraq at the same time and basically forced them to back off. And they were heckling, and it was like a little intifada, and you know, and then the decorum that I have to abide by at the press club, and you know, and I'm known for, you know, sort of being, you know, a bomb thrower relative to other people in venues like that.
You've been thrown out before, though that was much later.
That was much later, but I always pushed the envelope. I was suspended, and then they reinstated the suspension. And the other times I have gotten thrown out of other venues. But you know, the policies that she's talking about, and what you just said about how they worked with the Republicans and covered up for each other. Let me give a synopsis of what really happened. After the Gulf War in '91, after it ended, the UN passed a bunch of passed a huge resolution, and it said, we're going to keep the sanctions in place until you abide by your disarmament obligations. And by the way, you need to do these other things like pay Kuwait reparations and so on and so forth. The U.S. immediately undermined that. It started with Jim Baker, the Secretary of State under Bush, saying, we're going to keep the sanctions in place no matter what. And this effectively created a disincentive for Iraq to comply with the weapons inspectors. Albright continued that policy. That was actually the first time I saw her in 1997, her first major address in Washington, D.C., after she'd actually gone and visited Baker in Texas, came to D.C. and she said, we are resolute that we will continue this policy. He has to abide by all of the UN Security Council resolutions, and basically he has to prove his peaceful intentions. Completely subjective criteria where the U.S. is the judge, jury, and executioner. I mean, does the U.S. have peaceful intentions? It's an absurd standard. So they basically said, and after she made that address, I much later learned Ralph Achaeus, who was then the head of the inspections regime, said that they're killing us. They're making it so that we can't do our work because they're creating this disincentive. And Tariq Aziz, the deputy prime minister of Iraq, immediately called him and said, "What the hell? They're going to keep the sanctions in place no matter what. Well, you got to change this." Another aspect of this, and there are other nuances to all of that, but another aspect of all of this, she talked about the Oil for Food program. Oil for Food program was headed by two Assistant Secretary Generals of the UN. Dennis Halliday was the first one, an Irishman, and then Hans von Spanek, who's kind of infamous. He's German, and his father attempted to assassinate Hitler, and they both, in succession, resigned under protest and disgust. Halliday called the policies genocidal, and were saying, they were backing up those numbers that Stahl cited. I never pinned much hope on those numbers. Some people have quibbled with them, and there was The Intercept recently had a piece that cited a British Medical Journal article, and I think that British Medical Journal article needs to be treated carefully. A lot of the language in that is not what you would expect in an academic article. And it also, interestingly, has the same myth in it. The actual British Medical Journal article, which came out in, I think, 2017.
Sam, is that the one where they said that those numbers are much lower, most likely much lower? Yeah, I remember that. Sorry to interrupt.
No, quite all right. And I think they only took issue with one of the studies. I mean, there were many, many studies during this period. But that British Medical Journal article, and I'm not, I can't judge the numbers kind of thing, but striking in that article at the third sentence of it, it claimed that the sanctions would stay in place so long as Saddam Hussein didn't disarm, which is outright false. The Intercept actually made that point. I think they cribbed from my previous work, where I had been pounding away at this during the late 1990s to say the U.S. policy is to maintain the sanctions no matter what Iraq does. And so Saddam Hussein would occasionally kick out the weapons inspectors. And I think this is important now when we talk about Putin and when we talk about other things in terms of how the U.S. backs other leaders into a corner where they basically have no other choice but to do certain things. Saddam Hussein did kick out the weapons inspectors periodically because he had nothing else he could possibly do. He would give a speech saying, can we resolve this? Nobody would respond to the speech. He couldn't couldn't fire missiles. If he fired missiles, they'd, level the country. So there was literally no other recourse he could do. So at strategic times, he did throw them out, and then he'd immediately let them back in. And they obviously didn't like that, but he was only doing that clearly because the United States was saying, we're going to keep the sanctions in place no matter what. So that was the ultimate dynamic. And ultimately, UNSCOM collapsed because of that U.S. policy. And you had this interesting thing of Scott Ritter was wanting to, he was the media golden boy from like 94, 95 till 97, 98, because he was the tough Marine busting down doors. He's going to, catch Saddam and, make him comply. And he was still kind of doing that in 1998. He resigned because he said Madeleine Albright was holding him back from doing these inspections. And it was Joe Biden who went after Ritter at that point and saying that, he was making decisions above his pay grade. So you see this sort of incestuous thing where they're all covering up for each other. So Clintons, Biden, and Albright throughout the decades continuously covered up for each other. So when Ritter was finally challenging Albright's hypocrisies, it was Biden who slapped him down. Now Ritter was, kind of outflanking from the right, saying, you're letting Saddam Hussein bamboozle us. But he was being sort of an honest militarist. And then by the following year, Ritter had changed his tune because he realized what was actually going on was that they weren't letting Saddam off the hook. They just wanted to time when there would be a confrontation to their geopolitical and, in the case of Clinton, political advantage. You remember in 1998, he bombed Sudan and Afghanistan on the eve of his scheduled when Monica Lewinsky was testifying before the grand jury.
That's what I was just going to ask you about. Yeah, the timing of some of this is interesting.
It's remarkable.
Yeah.
It's remarkable. Obviously people realized some of it at the time, but other things came to light and parallels. We can get into that later in terms of Yugoslavia. And then
there was a lot going on at that point in time. It was the media was a cacophony of, and it was almost like the Trump years where it was just constant boom, boom, boom. Hitting Clinton. The right was really riled up. You had people I worked with had Rush Limbaugh on in the break room all the time, and it was just. I just want to point one more thing out for anybody who hasn't read this article yet. In the opening quote, I don't know if you call this a subtitle or what. Right after the title, Sam, is really well worded, where you say the title of the article is "Albright's Funeral: The Sword and the Cross Come Together," and then you say, from expanding NATO, falsifying about the Yugoslavia War, and sanctions on Iraq, Albright's association with Biden and the Clintons can be seen as a war-making, mutually absolving clique, which I really like that, mutually absolving clique. I mean, that was perfect, Sam.
Thank you. It continued on. I think that part of it was, Albright. It was very useful to Clinton to have a female Secretary of State amid his sex scandals. And and then, after, his impeachment was about to happen, and that's when he bombed Iraq with the Desert Fox bombing campaign. Congress delayed the impeachment for a couple of days, and then when it became clear that they were going to proceed with the impeachment, the bombing stopped. You don't like. In a way, it's like it was insidious and craven on Clinton's part, but it was also, it sort of distracted from how hideous the actual policy was because of the, self-serving timing of it. Like you said, it made all the information sort of come in from all different directions. And that's very well put. It's very much, I thought about this so many times in the midst of the Trump years, because the Trump years were sort of a prolonged period that sort of had a similar dynamic, and they did have a similar dynamic. Trump at one point bombed Syria amid the Stormy Daniels stuff. I think April 2018, I want to say. I've written about that somewhere.
It's amazing how the public can be so distracted with the sex scandals that they just stop paying attention to bombing places. It's just amazing.
Yeah, and I think that part of the way that the media work is like the constant distractions in the end mean that no thought can be, can go to its logical conclusion, right? Just when you're about to say, oh, okay, wow, our policy on Iraq is really bad. Oh, hold on, what's going on over there? So, it's like a continuous ADD.
Mm-hmm.
After, Clinton wasn't convicted by the Senate in early 1999, and but he was political toast. Like no governor would meet with him. It looked like, he might serve the rest of his term as a Rose Garden presidency where he just have to sit in the White House, and nobody wanted to meet with him. And he got a couple of breaks, but he still had this cloud hanging over his head, obviously from the impeachment and everything. But it wasn't really until the Yugoslavia War, which was called Albright's War, that in the establishment discourse gave the administration gravitas and relevance and all of this stuff. And I thought it was really functional because, that distracted from Iraq, because then they could talk about the genocide, the alleged genocide by the Serbs in Kosovo, which they wildly exaggerated. And I think that really is a main precursor to what we have now in Ukraine, because it was part of the whole expanding NATO thing, which Albright was, the lead person on, basically. If you go back to the picture, which is at the top of my article, I can't remember, what does it say? Expanding NATO, stability for the stability and security in the 21st century, NATO enlargement, and Albright standing over his shoulder, and then the bombing of Yugoslavia, where they say they're the Serbs are they Albright claimed genocide at that point. So it's sort of the mirror image of what Putin claims with the Donbass region in Ukraine. So it kind of set the precedent for what Putin is doing.
Right. So a lot of, I think, those of us, gosh, I hate to say left, but I guess those of us on the left and independent left media now that are really we're certainly not in support or defending what Putin has done, but there's just this understanding and acknowledgement that this has a lot to do with NATO expansion. And when I read that part in the article about that, that Madeleine Albright really kind of pushed Clinton, or was standing over him, to expand NATO, I remembered a part of Oliver Stone's Putin, what is it? Is it Putin Diaries or Putin, whatever, the film he did on him?
Interviews, yeah.
Putin Interviews, yes. And there was this part where Putin is talking to Oliver Stone about Clinton and a meeting that they had. And that there was this sort of like, I don't know if it was just totally a joke, but Putin did kind of chuckle about it. Like, could Russia join NATO?
Right.
Like Clinton, did he say like, yeah, maybe this is possible? And then, he was basically lorded over by Albright. I don't know. I thought about that because, who knows whether if he had really any say, you wonder if he had any say so in this, especially after being in that weakened position after the impeachment.
Yeah, you really do wonder. I get into this in my article there was a precursor on Iraq where, like a week before Clinton took office, he said Bush, the older Bush 1, was bombing Iraq right before Clinton was about to take office. And Clinton said, I'll judge Saddam Hussein by his actions. If he wants a new relationship, all he has to do is change his behavior. Basically saying, I'm open to changing this and He didn't talk directly about the sanctions, but about sanctions, about resuming diplomatic relations, whatever. And immediately the New York Times pounced on him, and his own incoming Secretary of State, the predecessor for Madeleine Albright, Warren Christopher, pulled the rug out from under him and said, I don't understand this. Clinton said, I'm a Baptist. I believe in deathbed convergence. And Warren Christopher is like, I don't get this Baptist stuff. And so they basically said, we're going to keep the sanctions in place, which Madeleine Albright reaffirmed at a time when the rest of the world was saying enough already in later in the mid-90s. So one does get the sense that you have opportunistic politicians like Clinton, and they sort of aren't fully in control and are wind vanes reacting to what the establishment wants them to do. And if they don't do the right bidding, they're going to get hammered.
Right. Well, with Trump, I mean, look at how the media reacted when he was trying to be cordial or whatever, with Putin and even Kim Jong-un. And actually, even I remember when Obama was first in office, and the right was going crazy because he's like, I need to repair, relations around the world. And it's like this big no-no to get along with other countries. It's just kind of shocking. You see, it's kind of reinforces the idea that, yes, there is this unelected force behind everything. Call it the deep state or whatever it is, but that you're elected, but you're not really in control when you get in there.
Yeah.
So.
That's another thing Putin said in the interview, the Putin interviews, that the president changes, but the policies don't.
Yep.
The foreign policy,
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about something. Oh gosh, it starts with an R. Let me find it. In NATO, it was
Rambouillet.
Thank you. Yes. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. That was another sort of deceit, like the sanctions policies. They were having these peace talks at a French castle called Rambouillet to try to resolve the situation in Kosovo with the Serbs. And they ironed out an agreement, which I understand they really pushed the Serbs. They thought that the Serbs wouldn't accept the deal. It was very favorable to the Kosovar Albanians. But the Serbs said, okay, we'll take it. We're going to eat crow here and we're going to accept this. So then the U.S. throws in this appendix to the agreement, Appendix B, which basically says NATO will have free and unfettered access throughout the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, not just Kosovo, the southern region of Yugoslavia, but the entire thing, including Serbia, including Belgrade. Obviously, when I remember I read it to Rockler, one of the last of the Nuremberg prosecutors, and he was like, "That sounds like the surrender agreement, from World War II." So the Serbs obviously said no to that. And the U.S. used that as a pretext. It was Albright and Holbrooke and Clark, General Clark, were sort of the triumvirate in all of that. And that basically...
Like the poison pill.
Yeah, exactly. It was a complete poison pill, and it gave them this bogus pretext to start bombing. And it would later come out, one of the State Department people would later talk about this. George Kenney would say, Albright would openly say the Serbs need some bombing. And she actually sort of coordinated, according to Kenney, with members of the press. They knew what she was doing and they weren't reporting it, according to Kenney. And I've never seen any in-depth investigation on that. There probably should be, as to which reporters were involved with that. Other thing that I should mention about Putin rose to power right during this period. Yeltsin was the president when the U.S. was bombing Yugoslavia, and he was warning of World War III at that point. And he was incredibly pro-U.S. I mean, I think he was derided in Russia as sort of being a pushover. for U.S. economic policies and so on. 5 days after the bombing started in Yugoslavia, Yeltsin appoints Putin to head their foreign policy committee. A couple of months after that, he makes him prime minister, and by the end of the year, he's acting president. So you can sort of see that the U.S.'s, extreme aggressiveness. It was an illegal war. They actually tried to get approval for it from Congress, and they lost. It was a tie vote. It didn't pass. It still, continued. The bombing still went on, and just that extreme aggressiveness, I think, prompted the Russians to really recalibrate. Although, as you say, Putin wasn't at all diehard anti-American. He wanted to be in NATO. It looked like he wanted to. I think he wanted to be treated as something of an equal in NATO, and the U.S. obviously wasn't going to have that. And then, of course, after 9/11, Putin was very forthcoming to the United States.
Yeah, it was very wanted to be integrated into Europe to at least some extent, is what people say. But what I've also heard is that was a real pivot turning point, the bombing of Serbia, and that was a real wake up call. So there's that too, as to Putin's attitude. I don't know whether it completely changed his attitude, but it certainly at least gave them pause about, how optimistic they could be about the future of the relationship.
Yeah.
It made some people really, really, really angry. It's been used as a precedent now too, or at least tried. Putin brings it up a lot, and so do many people.
Yeah, with very, very good cause. And this was also an early polarization with China, because the U.S., NATO bombed the Chinese embassy, claimed it was a mistake. The British Observer later investigated and, said that they had several sources that said it was intentional.
And timed, right? Well timed. When exactly?
Yeah, I mean, they didn't do that. I looked at the timing of it, and I found that the timing of it was incredible. The day before the Chinese embassy was bombed, the main topic of discussion was where were the Chinese? The Russians and the U.S. were seemingly on the verge of brokering a deal at the UN that would allow UN forces to go into Yugoslavia, so that it would sort of limit NATO's complete unilateralism. And everybody was saying, are the Chinese going to veto? Are the Chinese going to go along with this? And then the next day is when the U.S. bombed the Chinese embassy. Peter Lee, who's a China watcher, has written about how much that bombing really inflamed sentiment in China, in terms of, that we have to militarize, we have to, you can't be pushed around, a sense of nationalism and so on, which, might have been a desired impact, the desired outcome by the United States. I mean, you never know what the actual goals are. They're very rarely the stated goals. I mean, it's quite possible that parts of the U.S. establishment, deep state, whatever you want to call it, want a level of antagonism with Russia, with China, to justify their own militarism. They need an enemy, a plausible enemy. You can only make, Saddam out to be the, great menace and the great Hitler for so long.
Well, after so many conflicts, it's hard to come up with a different answer. That there is, that seems to be the most plausible answer. I have a friend who, she is actually ethnically Armenian, moved to Russia as a baby, and then left there when she was about 22. And interestingly, like she says, well, I'm anti-Russian, and her whole family's left. But she and I got talking back and forth, and my position, again, kind of like I said earlier, is not pro-Putin. I'm not for what he did, but I'm also, I have a problem with the NATO expansion and using Ukraine by proxy, as it seems. But anyway, what she said to me, she says about Putin, that he could have taken Russia toward Europe, but he chose the Asian way because he wanted power. And I thought, not to try not to argue with a friend too much here, but I don't know how much. I mean, Putin wasn't even president at the time she left, so the state of Russia that she remembers that was so bad was not under Putin anyway. I don't know, but this was her take on it. And I said, well, NATO, that was never going to happen for him to turn the other way anyway. So I don't know. I always try to understand what the other side basically thinks about this. So I wonder what you think about just that statement.
I'm not sure. I mean, the whole world has changed. The whole world is pivoting towards Asia. I mean, the U.S. keeps saying it wants to pivot towards Asia.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's where a lot of capital is going. That's where a lot of economic and other activity is going. So Putin could be just simply reacting to objective conditions. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know about that.
Can we step back for a second? And after I read your article, I realized how much I don't know about Madeleine Albright. I remember her being Secretary of State, and she always pops into the foreign policy scene, on and off. And then, of course, I remember very well when Hillary was running for office, and she, played a role in that.
Tell our story about how we climbed the ladder, and a lot of you younger women don't think you have to. It's been done. It's not done, and you have to help. Hillary Clinton will always be there for you. And just remember, there's a special place in hell for women who don't help each other.
But can we sort of go back and just talk maybe like a bare bones timeline of her career?
Well, her mentor, I think this is quite significant, was Zbigniew Brzezinski.
Okay.
Who was Jimmy Carter? Who was
that explains everything. No, sorry.
Who was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, and she was on his staff. I think she was the congressional liaison, and he, his big claim to fame was that he got Carter to arm the Afghan rebels in May of 1979. That is more than 6 months before the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. And he would claim credit for having, in effect, drawn them in. From his point of view, he was handing the Soviets their Vietnam, dragging them into an unwinnable war in Afghanistan. And I mean, it sort of, people think of Ronald Reagan arming the Mujahideen and Charlie Wilson's war and all of that. But all of that, the seed of that, the start of that, was Brzezinski under Carter. And he was very proud of that and bragged about it. And, it's like, what's a bunch of Islamists compared to bringing down the Soviet Empire? And I mean, it's worth noting the Afghan government before the Soviets invaded was very, women had rights, and it was a very progressive government. I mean, it was definitely a proxy for the Soviets in many ways, but it was independent and rather, it had some progressive features, at least in terms of.
Yeah, it's shocking to learn that stuff.
Like those pictures from the 70s.
Yeah, exactly.
I know the stories that we hear are so different. I was listening to a 60 Minutes interview of her back in the 90s sometime. And she was talking about her childhood. And because I always wonder, like, what makes someone this kind of warmonger person? And she talks about remembering as a child, seeing London bombed, and then that she was sent off to school, I think in Switzerland at the age of 10, alone. But, you think, wow, I think it was John McCain also that witnessed, or his father was in the war. It's interesting that those things that happen, like their experiences maybe when they're kids, that has this impact on them to become what they do later. So I just thought that was really interesting. And then I guess as it turns out, I think Bill Clinton mentioned in the eulogy that Albright didn't learn until she was Secretary of State, that three of her grandparents probably died in Auschwitz because they converted to, I think, Presbyterian or I don't know, but they were actually Jewish, so at least on one side. So yeah, just interesting that there's that history. And
yeah, there was a lot of speculation at the time. How could somebody as seemingly cosmopolitan as Albright not have figured out?
Yeah, that sounded a little fishy to me, actually. But
yeah,
I don't know.
A lot of people. I didn't look into it, but a lot of people were highly skeptical of it when it came out. That I remember Alexander Coburn making fun of it. That he imagined a conversation between the Saudis and Clinton because William Cohen is Jewish, the head of the Pentagon, and and Sandy Berger, National Security Advisor, and so in Coburn's imagining, they couldn't let couldn't tell the Saudis we were going to have 3 Jewish folks atop the foreign policy hierarchy.
Hey, we have some strange sound going on here. I'm not sure what's happening. One sec. Let me try something. No, I'm trying to figure out where it is. Joanne, I'm afraid it's on your end.
What is it? It could be the fan from my computer.
Maybe so.
Or it could be a cat behind me that's snoring. Is that it?
You've got a good.
I was hoping it didn't come through my mic, but
that's
it's right back here.
So we got talking about religion, so we should go there since you said you've done several interviews and that hasn't really come up about the National Cathedral and the Episcopalian Church. We just had Colin Powell's service there a year ago.
Right. And it was Albright who eulogized Powell, my good friend Powell, and that sort of showed the continuity of things. They kept the sanctions policy from Baker, from the first Bush administration, and then handed it off to the second Bush administration, with Colin Powell ultimately overseeing the actual invasion. And it was, Cohen. Nobody remembers this, but Cohen, the head of the Pentagon, would go on talk shows with a bag of sugar, kind of similar to Powell with his little vial of, that he waved around at the UN. Again, very much a hand in glove routine going on here. So she eulogized Powell last year. And then was now, as we say, eulogized at the National Cathedral by Biden and the Clintons. And what's remarkable is like the way that the National Cathedral, the so-called National Cathedral, I mean, it's just the seat of the Episcopalian bishop in Washington, D.C. It has no national. There was supposed to be in the original plans for Washington a cathedral for great national purpose in the plan, but it was scrapped. It didn't happen because of obvious concerns about separation of church and state. That site is now, I think, the Portrait Gallery, But eventually they built this cathedral, called it the National Cathedral. I think the president at the time, Harding or somebody, made a statement in favor of it or something like that. But there's no actual function of it. It's a branding exercise by the Episcopalian Church. And they do pretend to do some progressive stuff, but mostly what it does is act as a venue for events like this.
It's optics. It's to me, it's just optics.
It's an incredible prop that
Mhm.
that serves as a enabler of empire. It's where Bush made his first major speech after 9/11. It's the national. It's a national cathedral, the same way the singer Madonna is the mother of Jesus Christ. It's purely a for show thing. They say the spiritual home of the nation or something is their tagline, but like this thing with Albright was by invitation only. It was all honorifics, and the speech that the rector gave was just remarkable. It was like she likened Albright fighting to get to be Secretary of State with Jesus Christ washing the feet of his disciples. Like that's her level of service. With her ridiculous ambitious tenacity to want to get the Secretary of State job. Is similar to someone lowering themselves to be to washing the feet of those around them. It was just convoluted, and just listening to the service, it was so orchestrated. It was a 3-hour service. I actually listened to the whole thing. The word Iraq was not mentioned throughout the whole thing. I mean, if you had said back in the 1990s, Albright's going to die in this year, and they're going to mention Iraq in a 3-hour service, you'd be considered nuts. But that, they don't want to, indicate that that's what this really meant, that she wasn't,
Right. Well, I think it might be a good time. I could play this. It's very, very short clip of Bill Clinton, and he's talking about that part about Haiti. So I'll play that.
When I first heard that she'd passed away, the very first thing I did, I was home in New York, was to go into the kitchen and look at these 2 beautiful paintings from Haiti that Madeline gave Hillary and me, because she knew how much we cared about what happened there.
Sam, I don't think you weren't looking, but I added two photos at the end of that there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's no problem. One was a picture of Bill and Hillary in Haiti, and another one is a Haitian woman holding up a sign that says like Hillary's for jail or something. So yeah, I mean, it's all about like just keeping the narrative going and the optics, and it's just amazing. Back in the 90s, like I said, I was busy being mom, and I've learned all of this stuff, in recent years. You guys both have been reporting on this and reading and learning about it for a long time. So I'm kind of playing catch up. But, even what happened in Yugoslavia, it's a lot to take in when you don't. I mean, I don't know that I would have really been more informed anyway had I watched the news back then, but I didn't. Randy Credico had George Samueli on not too long ago, and he talked about his book, Bombs for Peace. So I listened intently and took lots of notes, but yeah, it's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
But I don't see what good we're doing in the world. And I think more and more Americans are just seeing this, billions of dollars poured into Ukraine now, money going when they can't take care of our own, we can't take care of our own citizens. And it's just really hard to understand who still believes this. We're spreading democracy. It just doesn't add up. But so I really appreciated your article. I thought it was fantastic. And I learned even more. So
thank you. Thank you. And I mean, the Clinton comment was kind of notable because usually they're sort of covering up for each other, and here he was giving him his own self a compliment by saying, Albright, Madeline knew how much we care about Haiti. If you look at the policies, Clinton, while he was president, after the fact, there was so much corruption, and he kind of enabled the coup against Aristide and so on that really ushered in a lot of the horrors that Haiti had to endure. It's such a it's just such a little tiny clique of people that are all glad mouthing each other. And another part of this whole thing is that Albright, after she left being Secretary of State, she started this consulting firm and mentored a lot of the people. Greenfield, who's now at the UN and is covering up for the Saudis bombing Yemen, trying to make sure the UN doesn't rein that in. Wendy Sherman, the guy who heads up the main part of USAID. I'm blanking on his name. A whole bunch of people came out of that, out of her consulting firm. So, her spirit very much lives on. And I think that, I think that her funeral was sort of a milestone in how they configure themselves.
Well, you mentioned also when you had a link in your article about the most powerful religions and the ones basically with the most money, which was really kind of surprising to me. But yeah, so Episcopalian is the most rich Christian religion. I did not know that. But I thought it was very interesting that atheists and agnostics are climbing the list here. But, yeah, I thought that was interesting. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, money, that doesn't surprise me. And we live, and I mean, I still don't understand why we don't tax church and sports. But what a great place to hide money and push your agenda through that. So yeah.
Well, I mean, they certainly are pushing an agenda, or, as I say, enabling empire. And it's hard not to draw attention to the fact that it's the most wealthy Christian denomination that's doing this and has the presumption to call itself the National Cathedral. I think does speak to some of the sociological dynamics that we're talking about here. A key part of this was, just how they came together and the continuity of the personnel, and how, Biden was, brought into office by the way that the media configured things over the last, during the election, and how other candidates withdrew at times that were strategic, for Biden. There were times when it really felt more like a coronation than anything else. So I think that speaks to a level of extreme control that the establishment has over allegedly, electoral institutions, so that you have this continuity from Bush 1 to Clinton to Bush 2 to Obama, who was there but didn't say anything, didn't speak, and so on. I felt like my piece it didn't give a history of the last 25 years, but it sort of gave a foreshadowing, during this period of when Albright was Secretary of State, sort of gave a foreshadowing.
No, and it really ties it all together and shows you how clearly it's all orchestrated, and how really sinister it is. I wonder what we're facing next. I mean, maybe we might have a little bit more free speech. I don't know, on Twitter. I guess that's yet to be seen, but I don't know. But we've got this, what is it? The Biden disinformation group or something, whatever office.
And it's incredible to me that happened just as the whole Elon Musk thing happened.
Oh, right.
Again, I'm always thinking of the timing. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So these two things are happening at the same time. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And there's already, even Homeland Security admits that it already has like 3 different departments within the Homeland Security Department that have been assigned with this disinformation task. So why they needed this specialized board is quite interesting. But yeah, it's interesting for a lot of reasons, but especially the timing. And just it's just this freak out again of, again, I hate to bring up Trump again, but the same kind of freak out that happened after he was elected. I just don't understand where that comes from. It's so out of proportion to what's really happening. It's crazy.
I think they must have some sense. I think it really became obvious when Bernie ran that there are a lot of people that are no longer buying what they're being told on television, and we know that the right and the Trump supporting people are very vocal about that. But there are a lot of us, I guess, again, I don't like the labels, but I'll just say the independent left, for lack of a better term. I mean, that we feel the same way, but we are the ones that are, I think, silenced maybe more than the right was, maybe not on Twitter, but yeah, I'd say probably about the same. So I found it really funny and I don't think it's any accident. I think it's by design that Musk is saying, he's saying the far left and referring to like the woke, whatever, Democrat voters. That's not the far left, but it's just like Trump saying radical Nancy Pelosi. I mean, it's just, and they're going to bring socialism and right. Okay. So it's all just pushing the same narrative, but I think that they know that there as many people still are watching the news, and you could see with the Albright funeral, whether it was PBS or all the major news channels had, played the whole funeral and recap and everything. There are a whole lot of people that aren't paying attention, don't care. They know they've given up. And so they know this. I think that, so this disinformation office, they're like, oh, how are we going to handle this going into to the midterms and into 2024? How are we going to control it? Because I don't know that at some point, short of just cutting everybody off, which they've done, with RT America, and a lot of great American journalists that were on there are off. And we know what YouTube does. But yeah, I think I think they're kind of in a bit of panic mode, actually, but we'll see.
Yeah, that's the freak out. There's a genuine panic going on, even though I do think that Elon Musk is just probably playing his part of the role of some, I don't know, some other faction of the power brokers. But there's this genuine freak out that happens. It seems to happen when, and this is just my guess, when they fear that some truth's going to come out. So, whether it seems like a relatively small amount of information or whatever, like there's some particular thing. In the 2016 election, one of the big things was, of course, the Hillary emails. But I think there are specific things, but I think it's also just the idea that that there might be any larger level of information, or maybe just the fact that someone else gets to decide what kind of information gets out, or that they can't be trusted with keeping all the secrets, something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, other people have made the point that, it's amazing that people are calling for less free speech, on or at least some people are who you would think would know better. And I think the dynamics around the pandemic, or it sort of escalated. It started on Russiagate, or what escalated with the whole Russiagate thing, and then got going, I think, with the pandemic. And now we're at this current stage where, it's completely normalized to be restricting speech. I did an interview with Nadine Sorensen, I hope I'm not mangling her last name, last year, where she made the case, and I've heard some people reiterate it since then, that there is a First Amendment case to be made regarding, so-called private platforms, particularly if there's collusion or coercion from the government. And I think you can clearly see now that there is clearly collusion and or coercion from the government. So even if it's technically a private platform, if the government is telling that private platform, you better act a certain way or we're going to bust your knees, if the private platform starts restricting speech or escalates its restrictions of speech, then that's a First Amendment issue. So one hopes that the courts will ultimately play a positive role here. But I think that, you were saying that there are all these levels of control. I think every time that people learn of another level of control, there's a sense of intimidation, right? And self-censorship happens out of fear. I, at the start of the pandemic, did work on pandemic origins, and I didn't tweet a lot of stuff that I knew because I felt like I would get bumped off of Twitter, and I didn't want to get bumped off of Twitter, so I focused on writing long articles, and then the article would come out, and hopefully the information would get out that way. So, yeah, I think that part of the multiple levels of things is
self-censorship. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, lots of methods of fear.
We did an interview, Sam, about that one article that you published in the spring of 2020, and I remember both of us being very worried about, the fact that we were even talking about this and cautious about everything that we said, and it was quite a time. I remember it well, and I intend to always remember that feeling.
Yeah. And, it was remarkable, the silencing that happened. And I think that, a large part of the left sort of regurgitated, establishment pablum about the impossibility of lab origin in that, in that thing. And the Biden administration has sort of come around to acknowledging that possibility. I think that they're probably doing it for ulterior motives. They want to blackball China in some ways, similar to what the Trump administration seemed to want to do, but that doesn't. And they want to limit it to, it's the Chinese are the problem, not the U.S. programs are the problem.
Well, there seem to be so few voices of reason, and maybe that was because the people that had that didn't want to speak up. But I do remember, like, I really, really appreciate, I love your work, and because you're just logical and skeptical, and you wrote something about, saying that it's possibly a lab leak, and saying that is not the same as saying it's a lab leak that was done on purpose. But it was like, nobody could look at that as if you said it could have been a lab leak, then you were saying it was just like madness. I don't know. People just all, like, logic went out the window. There's also an article not too long ago, Christian Parenti wrote about the lockdown left. I thought it was really good too, just talking about how everyone's like, it seemed like logic just went out the window, and the self-censorship, and he sort of likened it to Trump derangement syndrome had kind of morphed into COVID stuff, and we've all gotten so polarized that that was kind of maybe what led into it. And now, of course, that's changed into Ukraine, and there's divide on that. So, but,
that lockdown left article, some of the people who are championing that now, though, are some of the people who were the lockdown left in the beginning, and now they're using it to act like they weren't, or something like that.
Well, maybe they woke up. We can hope.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't mind people waking up, but I wish people would be more explicit about it when they change.
Mm-hmm.
I know Max,
Exactly.
Max has changed. Max Blumenthal has changed. I wish he would be more explicit about it. Maybe he was and I missed it, but I think he does a lot of strong work, but he doesn't always acknowledge that he's shifted. And I think it's good when people shift.
Well, I was going to make a clip of Albright saying the thing about having cojones. Do you know that?
Yeah, sure. Clinton talked about it at the funeral.
Oh, right. Yes, that's right. Okay.
Talking about how, gosh. And this was so funny from Clinton. He was like, man, you came up with the best soundbite.
Right.
It like sort of exuded like that was the whole point of the administration, to come out with really good sound bites.
before Twitter and all that.
Right.
But I was just going to say, it takes a lot of cojones to do what you've done, which is, to even though I know you've self-censored, I think that's smart, because, you don't want to lose.
And I've tried to be open about my own,
right.
Self-censor. I mean, it was a very particular set of circumstances. I didn't put on Twitter stuff. I mean, I would say what I wanted to say in the interviews that I had, but I didn't,
Yeah, but you've been way ahead of the game, and I'm grateful for.
Brave enough to speak.
Well, I think it's a tightrope we're walking, because I didn't research it enough in the beginning. I thought, I'm not going to step in this can of worms, and I just decided not to get into it with people on that topic of COVID and the vaccine and all that. But even now, it's amazing. Like, so I have my aunt died of COVID. She was only 74, and she did have some underlying health problems, but she had both vaccines. And I tell that story, and you would be amazed at how many, like, I don't know what to call them, the most rabid liberals are like, oh, so you're saying that there's no point to the vaccine. Like, everyone jumps to conclusions when you're just stating, no, I'm telling you, she was in a high-risk category. Therefore, I think it made sense for her to have the vaccines. But it didn't help in the end. It's just facts. So, but people, I don't know, the logic just, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I tell people my mom got the shingles after she got vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
And after that happened, I still had her have the booster. I mean, she's basically said she'll do whatever the heck I tell her to do, and I somewhat reluctantly but told her to get the vaccines because she's in a high risk category.
Mm-hmm.
And when I share that with people, same as you, it's like I'm making an argument against vaccine. I'm like, no, I'm just saying they have side effects, and you should be aware of it. So I think that there were a lot of failures with the whole pandemic thing. I mean, the scientific community sort of decided to march in lockstep and let a lot of at least with the lab origins issue, the most well-funded people, Peter Daszak and company, basically determined the agenda. And there was a complete breakdown of meaningful dialogue and debate, where, you had, Democracy Now! Just putting out a line and, impervious to any other facts. And of course, the rest of the establishment media was worse, except for the right wing, which did it for its own reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So we're in a bad dynamic here, and and again, and to me, it's tied to what we're talking about with Albright. It is a form of militarism. It's tied to the creation of deadly pathogens as part of tacitly a biological weapons program. So
do you remember you said it was Ohio State in the article? I think I saw at the end of that clip, she's talking about bioweapons, I believe, at the end of it.
Well, I mean, they were claiming that Saddam Hussein had biological weapons, which he didn't. The funny part about that is that if you talk to Dennis Halliday, the head of the Oil for Food program, he talks about the U.S. sanctions as being a bioweapon because it promulgated lots of diseases in Iraq. The U.S. knocked out the electrical and the water facilities in Iraq. So you had cholera and a whole lot of other things. And they used DU, so radiological weapons. So from a purely medical point of view, somebody on the ground like Dennis Halliday, he views things, these instruments that the U.S. used as that. And to maybe end this on a high note, that Ohio State meeting was heroic. People on the ground saw an opportunity and they jumped in and they forced the administration to back off, and they made it virtually impossible for them to launch a major attack on Iraq. And they did bomb Iraq at the end of that year during Clinton's impeachment, but it took the Bush administration in 9/11, with all of the crazy fear associated with that, for the establishment to be able to pull off a full-scale invasion of Iraq. So I think that's a lesson too. But the activism, upped the ante.
Right. Well, let's hope that that's successful in what's going on now. But I don't know. It's yet to be seen.
Okay. Sam, do you have time for a bonus question?
Sure.
All right. If we could go back to that, this is kind of a loosely formed. I'm really just looking for thoughts, not like I don't expect to have a specific answer or anything like that. But that part of your article where you say that Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said that Albright is his role model for me and so many of our diplomats. And then I remember Francis Boyle saying that the Biden administration is full of Zbigniew Brzezinski disciples, sort of, and there's some connections with the school that they both went to, and I don't remember exactly what the academic ties are. And you mentioned that Albright, what followed Zbig's policies. Whether he was a role model for her or not, I'm not quite sure. Maybe you could talk about that. So I have to wonder, since the State Department is well known for being cover for intelligence, definitely for CIA, maybe other kinds of intelligence agents, and then you have some connection with the neocons, the Victoria Newlands. And all of them have this sort of elitist attitude that you saw at that funeral, above, like on a pedestal. And I don't mean just a little elitist. I mean godlike elitist. But when the Clintons first came to Washington, I know they were treated like dirt, undeserving, not good enough, a low life, whether it was the Arkansas thing or what, I'm not quite sure. I'm just wondering, does that attitude come from, because I also noticed that same kind of godlike pedestal attitude exists in the CIA and in the intelligence community. I hate that term. Are there any dots to connect in the things that I just mentioned there? Visit aroundtheempire.com to find the various ways that you can gain access to the bonus content, join the Discord community, and participate in the periodic Zoom calls where we talk among ourselves. I hope that some of you will join us, and now we'll continue with the wrap-up. Sam, we've kept you a long time. Should we roll back into the public part of the interview and ask if you have any final thoughts? And please tell everybody how to follow your work, where to read you, how to support you.
I'd love it if people would subscribe to my Substack. That's how I'm hoping to get my stuff out. They can go to Husseini.org, which is on the bottom there, I guess. And it'll link to the Substack so they can see all my past writing and they can see my recent stuff at Substack. Right now, I'm not asking for money, but I'm probably going to start, putting up some stuff that's paid and some stuff that's unpaid. So I'm hoping that people will support my work that way going forward. Thank you so much.
More important than ever to.
Yeah, I mean, people out there, should understand it takes time. What you're doing takes time. What I'm doing takes time and effort, and there aren't too many people doing things with our particular flavor that are making too much.
Right. And you make it seem easy, but that article, I mean, that was a lot. That
was not easy.
A lot of work. But you have it all up here, though.
Well, it was.
But yeah, I recommend everyone, if you haven't read it, please read it. It's fantastic. So, thank you, Sam, for taking so much time with us.
Thank you, Kelley. Thank you, Joanne.
Great to see you again, Sam. Take care. Thanks for listening. Special thanks to Sam Husseini. Follow Sam on Twitter at Sam Husseini and subscribe to his Substack. Find his past writings at Husseini.org and his artwork at BeThatEmpty.org. This is a fully independent podcast, and in the age of censorship, your support is more important than ever. Go to the website aroundtheempire.com to find the various ways you can get access to bonus content and support the show. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, leave reviews. All of those things help. Follow on Twitter at Around the Empire. Join us on Telegram, t.me/AroundTheEmpire. And we'll see you next time. Take good care, everybody.